Welcome to Reformed Thinking. You, the listener, are stepping into an investigation of, well, ancient language and theology today.
Yeah, we are taking a look at a massive stack of sources for this deep dive.
We really are. We have linguistic lexicons like Kittle and Beatty and G, historical commentaries, theological treatises.
Right, all the heavy hitters.
Yeah, and our focus is this single, highly significant Greek word family, which is the seb root, S-E-B.
And this is the family of words that encompasses ideas of awe, reverence, piety, and worship.
Right, and we are going to trace these words from ancient Homeric poetry through classical Greek philosophy into the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, and then finally into the New Testament.
It's a massive timeline.
It is, yeah. I mean, think of language like a geological core sample. You drive this massive drill into the earth, pull up a cylinder of rock, you can see all the different layers of time just stacked on top of each other.
Yeah, like a layer of ash from a volcano, and then maybe a layer of crushed seashells from an ancient ocean, and then hard granite.
Yeah, spot on. By looking at the layers of how this specific Greek root was used across centuries, we can see precisely how the biblical authors were shaping their theology in contrast to the surrounding pagan culture.
So to understand what worship means in the New Testament, we first have to look at the physical, biological reaction the ancient Greeks associated with the divine.
Which is fascinating because we usually think of worship as, singing or praying.
Right, but our objective here is to uncover how a word that originally meant physical shrinking or flinching evolved to define the center of Christian life and worship.
Wait, flinching? Like literally stepping back?
Yeah, literally. The stem seb originally meant to fall back before or to physically shrink away. It was an involuntary bodily movement.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. When we look at Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, we see this played out vividly. Like, in the Iliad, Agamemnon is out on the battlefield rallying his troops.
And you have to picture the sheer chaos of ancient Bronze Age warfare here.
Oh, totally. There is the clash of spears, the screams of men, the overwhelming dust, and just the very real terror of a violent death.
Right.
And Agamemnon yells at his soldiers, asking if they do not shrink back in cowardice. And he uses a form of this seb word.
So it's a literal recoil of the human body in the face of an overpowering force.
Yeah, it's biological.
That bodily reaction completely changes the way we think about awe. I mean, it makes me think of the involuntary physical step back a person takes when looking over the edge of the Grand Canyon for the first time.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. You walk up to the rim and your body just reacts before your brain even processes the view. It is an overwhelming encounter with majesty, and you flinch at the scale of it.
Yeah, you get that vertigo feeling.
Yeah.
And later in Homer's writings, when the hero Nestor sees young Telemachus for the first time, he is struck by how much the boy looks like his father, Odysseus. And the text says Nestor is seized with awe. It is a physical arresting of his motion.
So it's not just a mental realization. His body actually stops.
Right. And we also see descriptions of the immortals experiencing a physical stepping back when seeing the goddess Athene. Their bodies recognize a scale or a glory that eclipses them.
Even the gods flinch. That's incredible.
Yeah, but over time, as we move out of the Homeric era and into the classical and Hellenistic periods, that involuntary physical movement evolved. It turned into an inner attitude of respect for lofty things.
So the target of this awe shifted, essentially.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. It was no longer just a biological reaction to an overwhelming sight or a terrifying battlefield. It became a conscious respect for one's country, a sacred district, parents, or human virtue.
So the bodily recoil moved inward.
Yes, it became an internal disposition of the mind. A citizen felt this internal reverence when looking at the laws of their city-state or, honoring the legacy of their ancestors.
But if this word just meant standing in awe of something sublime, like a beautiful sunset or an honorable person, we need to ask when it became exclusively religious.
Right,
Because if you read classical Greek literature, they are applying this concept to human beings and physical locations all the time.
Yeah, that transition happens gradually. The internal attitude shifted outward again, but this time into a deliberate external act of honoring the gods.
Okay, so it goes from an internal feeling to an external ritual.
Right. The historian Xenophon uses it to describe soldiers dedicating wreaths to Artemis. That is an explicit cultic act.
So they're not just feeling an internal sense of awe anymore.
No, they are performing a ritual to demonstrate it. The internal reverence demands an external liturgy. And what is fascinating here is how the Greek mind distinguished between two specific words.
Okay, lay them on me.
There's sebestai, which is valuing highly with reverence, and then there's deisedemonia, which means superstitious fear.
See, that's really interesting because we tend to lump all ancient pagan practice into one bucket of superstition.
Oh, absolutely we do.
We imagine the ancient Greeks constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified that Zeus was going to strike them with a lightning bolt if they, I don't know, dropped a piece of bread.
Yeah, just living in constant terror. But educated Greeks, like the philosopher Plutarch, made a very sharp distinction between rational awe and irrational panic.
Right, so Plutarch and other thinkers found superstition to be highly distasteful, didn't they?
They really did. True reverence, sebestai, was considered rational and honoring. It meant recognizing the majesty of the gods without assuming they were petty or cruel.
So you performed your civic sacrifices with dignity.
Right. Superstition, on the other hand, was characterized by a throbbing heart, terror, and the belief that the gods were constantly malicious and out to get you.
Okay.
Yeah, the rational Greek believed the divine order was pure and lofty, demanding dignified respect, not cowering panic.
So the superstitious person was viewed as someone who insulted the gods by treating them like unpredictable tyrants.
Yeah, basically calling the gods petty.
That brings up a massive collision of cultures, though. Because the Greek world used seb to describe a polite, civic duty to impersonal gods, Jewish scholars translating the Old Testament into Greek faced an enormous linguistic problem.
Yeah, they really hit a wall.
This brings us to the Septuagint. And for some context for you listening, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, produced a couple of centuries before Christ in Alexandria, Egypt.
It was a huge deal.
A massive undertaking. It was intended to make the Jewish law accessible to Greek-speaking Jews who could no longer read Hebrew.
And the Jewish scholars working in Alexandria looked at this Greek word family, this seb root, that just saturated the religious and civic culture around them, and they used it very rarely.
Almost never, right?
Yeah, out of the vast expanse of the Old Testament, the translators actively avoided mapping their concept of worship onto this Greek word.
And we have to ask why they hesitated. I mean, if the translators were tasked with bringing Hebrew ideas into the Greek language, and the Greeks already had a robust vocabulary for worship and reverence, it seems like an obvious choice.
It does, but linguistically, the Semitic world had no direct parallel to sebomai.
The concepts just didn't line up.
No, the Hebrew equivalents centered around highly relational physical actions. They use words like proskunane, which means bowing down to kiss the ground,
Oh, wow.
or yer, which is fearing the Lord, or ibed, which means working for or obeying a master. The Greek concept of seb lacked the covenantal relational weight of the Hebrew text.
I think of this like trying to translate the concept of a handshake agreement into a culture that only understands notarized legal contracts.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. The words exist to describe an agreement, but the relational weight is missing entirely.
Yeah, because a handshake agreement relies on mutual trust, shared history, personal character.
Exactly. It is an intimate bond between two parties. But a notarized contract is purely administrative. You do not need to love or even trust the person you sign a contract with. You just have to fulfill the terms to avoid a penalty.
That analogy captures the tension perfectly. To a Greek, reverence was a civic virtue aimed at an impersonal divine order.
Just punching the clock, spiritually speaking.
Yeah, you did your duty to the city's gods to keep the machinery of the universe running smoothly. It was a transaction to ensure good crops, military victory, and social stability.
Right, but to a Jew, true religion was obedience and devotion to a personal creator who had entered into a specific historical covenant with his people.
He was not an abstract force holding the universe together. He was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He spoke to them, rescued them from Egypt, and gave them his law.
So in the few places the Septuagint actually uses seb, it often describes the worship of pagan idols.
Yeah, the translators essentially quarantined the word. They applied it almost exclusively to the false, impersonal worship of the surrounding nations.
Though there is one notable exception to this rule, and it occurs in the book of Jonah.
Oh, right. The storm.
Yeah. When the prophet Jonah is on the ship in the middle of a violent storm, he is surrounded by pagan sailors who are crying out to their various deities. And Jonah tells them, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven."
And in the Greek translation, he uses a seb word right there.
He does. But the context provides the rationale for it. He is speaking directly to pagans, contrasting his unique monotheistic devotion with their polytheism.
So he's using their vocabulary to communicate a contrast.
Yes, He is telling them that the kind of ultimate reverence they scatter among dozens of localized deities, he directs entirely to the one true creator of the sea and the dry land.
That makes total sense. And, by the time of the New Testament, this root word was heavily tied to the physical objects of cultic worship and the most powerful man on earth.
Right. Things get extremely political at this point.
Very. Let's look at two specific nouns from this family. Sebazma and sebastos. So sebazma means an object of worship or veneration. In Acts 17, the Apostle Paul walks through Athens. He sees a city saturated with idols.
The text says his spirit was provoked within him.
Yeah. And he stands up in the Areopagus, the intellectual center of the city, and points out their sebasmata, their objects of worship, their shrines, their altars. He uses their own civic term for these holy objects.
Right. And then in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul describes the man of lawlessness, stating this figure will exalt himself over every god or sebasma.
Yeah, it represents any physical thing humanity sets up to receive reverence.
Then there is sebastos, which raises the stakes to life or death for the early Christian church.
It really does.
Because the term shifts from describing an altar to describing a human being.
Right. Sebastos was the Greek translation of the Latin title Augustus. The Roman Senate conferred this title upon the emperor.
But it meant the exalted, right?
Yeah. It elevated the emperor above ordinary mortals, carrying an indefinite ring of majesty and divine status. It was not just a political rank, it carried heavy theological weight.
The Roman imperial cult viewed the emperor as the unifying divine figure of the entire empire.
Yes.
This creates an astronomical political tension. If Sebastos was the official title for the emperor, and the Christians claimed that Jesus alone is Lord, they were put in a very precarious position.
To say the least.
So how did Paul get away with claiming that all sebasmata in Athens were basically ignorant placeholders for the true God, without immediately being executed for treason?
Well, Christians were rarely put on trial simply for refusing to use the term sebastos in polite everyday conversation.
Really? It wasn't an everyday issue.
Not usually. We even see the Roman official Festus use it casually in Acts 25 when discussing Paul's appeal to Caesar. The lethal conflict arose when Christians were asked to offer physical sacrifices to the genius of the emperor or to call him Lord in a formal cultic setting.
So there was a line between civil respect and cultic worship.
Yeah, they could handle the vocabulary as a civil title for the head of state, but the moment it crossed into a physical act of ultimate allegiance, they drew a hard line.
Because the Romans viewed offering a pinch of incense to the emperor as a basic pledge of allegiance, a standard civic duty.
It was essentially the equivalent of putting your hand over your heart for a national anthem.
Right. They did not care if you also worshiped Jesus on Sunday, as long as you participated in the unifying ritual of the empire.
But the Christians viewed it as idolatry, a direct violation of the first commandment.
They understood that the creator of the universe demands exclusive loyalty. You cannot blend the worship of the living God with the state-sponsored worship of a human ruler.
And this cultural tension brings us to a crucial word in this linguistic family, eusebeia.
Eusebeia.
Yeah, it is often translated in English Bibles as piety or godliness. And it is a word the earliest Christians completely ignored until they suddenly could not ignore it anymore.
Which is such an interesting shift. Let's dig into what it meant to the Greeks first.
Well, in the Greek world, eusebeia comes from eu meaning good and seb meaning reverence. So it meant respect for the natural orders of life, family, state, laws, and the gods.
It was the highest possible civic virtue.
Yes. Socrates was called pious, a man of eusebeia, because he did nothing without the gods' consent and respected the laws of Athens to the point of drinking the hemlock rather than rebelling against his sentence.
He accepted the judgment of the city because he revered the civic order.
Right. And later philosophers like Epictetus taught that true piety was rational acceptance of the god's will, not just offering animal sacrifices.
So it was an entire philosophical framework for how to be a good, upright citizen who maintained the stability of society.
Exactly. Yet, despite being the highest moral compliment a Greek could receive, the word is entirely absent from the Gospels.
Completely missing.
Yeah, it is completely missing from all the earlier letters of the Apostle Paul. You read Romans, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and there is no mention of eusebeia.
And if we look at the theological framework of the early church, this omission makes perfect sense.
Right, because
Early Christians avoided the word because eusebeia placed focus heavily on human conduct and evaluated it as a moral virtue.
it implied allegiance to impersonal cosmic orders rather than a personal savior.
It was a works-based concept. You achieve eusebeia by doing your duty, keeping your head down, pulling your own weight, and maintaining the status quo.
Yeah, it's very much about human achievement.
It is like a modern person refusing to use the phrase good karma.
Oh, that's a spot-on analogy.
Right. Even if someone knows what you mean when you say, I'm putting good karma out into the universe, the phrase carries specific philosophical baggage.
Karma is a system of cosmic cause and effect based on your own merit.
Right, and that conflicts with the Christian understanding of grace and providence, where God blesses the undeserving. You avoid the vocabulary because the worldview attached to it contradicts your core convictions.
Yeah, you just don't use the word. So Paul replaced Greek civic eusebeia with pistis, meaning faith, and agape, meaning love.
Faith and love.
Right. They rely entirely on God's grace. They are responses to a personal redeemer rather than human achievements of civic virtue.
Because early Christianity was an announcement of something God had done in history to save sinners. It was not a new manual for being a respectable, self-made citizen in the Roman Empire.
No, not at all. But then, the timeline of Paul's letters reveals a sudden shift.
He starts using the word.
Yeah. After decades of avoiding the word, eusebeia explodes in usage in Paul's letters to Timothy and Titus.
The Pastoral Epistles.
Yes, the Pastoral Epistles. Suddenly, godliness is everywhere in the text. It becomes a central theme. It is used to describe a specific manner of life.
We see phrases like, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified.
Right. And it is repeatedly contrasted with the teachings of adversaries who were infiltrating the churches in Ephesus and Crete.
So we need to define who these adversaries were and what they were pushing. I mean, if Paul is suddenly obsessing over living a quiet, physical, godly life, it implies someone else was telling the early Christians to do the exact opposite.
Yes.
Was someone trying to, spiritualize them out of their own bodies?
That is precisely what was happening. The adversaries were promoting a form of proto-Gnostic asceticism.
Okay, proto-Gnostic asceticism. Break that down for us.
Sure. So we need to understand the prevailing Greek philosophical view of the physical world. Many Greek thinkers operated on a strict dualism.
Spirit versus matter.
Right. They believed that the spiritual realm was pure and good, while the physical realm, matter, flesh, the earth, was inherently corrupt, heavy, and evil.
The human soul was seen as a divine spark, trapped in an evil physical prison.
Yeah, that was the mainstream philosophical view. So salvation in that Greek mindset meant escaping the physical body. It meant shedding the material world.
And these false teachers in the early church were adopting that framework.
They were. They were telling Christians that to be truly spiritual, you had to punish the physical body.
By doing what?
Well, they were forbidding marriage. They were demanding strict dietary restrictions. They despised the secular orders of life, viewing the physical world as corrupt and aiming for a purely spiritual, detached existence.
They thought true religion was entirely disconnected from physical obligations.
Right. And the biblical author responds with a brilliant theological maneuver.
I love this part.
The opponents claim to be spiritual by rejecting physical reality. So Paul reclaims the pagan word eusebeia to argue that true religion is honoring God the Creator by living well within the created everyday orders of life.
Raising a family, working a job, participating in society.
Yes. These are not distractions from ultimate reality. They are the very theater where faith is lived out.
This brings up the theology of vocation, which is a massive part of the Reformed tradition.
Oh, totally.
God is the creator, and matter is not an evil prison for the soul.
Right.
God made the physical world, and he called it good.
Right.
Therefore, honoring the creator by living a quiet, faithful life is the truest form of citizenship.
Yeah.
You worship God by changing diapers, plowing a field, fixing a wagon wheel, and eating food with gratitude.
I mean, all of life is lived before the face of God. It is a massive affirmation of the material world.
It is not an ecstatic, out-of-body ideal. It is a grounded, everyday honoring of the Creator. So they took a pagan word that meant being a good civic citizen and baptized it to say, actually, honoring the Creator by living a quiet, faithful life is the truest form of citizenship.
That's spot on. The pastorals take the Greek ideal of respecting the social order, but they ground it entirely in the doctrine of creation.
So you respect marriage and food because God made them good.
Right. You live a quiet life not just to please the Roman magistrate, but to display the sanity and goodness of the gospel to a watching world.
The motivation is completely overhauled, even as the vocabulary is adopted. True eusebeia is seeing the physical world as a gift from God and stewarding it faithfully.
Yes, but if eusebeia is honoring the created order, we have to look at its exact opposite.
Right, the negative side of the coin.
Yeah, asabeia or ungodliness.
Okay, so how did ancient culture view the ungodly person, and how did that differ from simply being an atheist?
Well, in the ancient city-state, you could not be neutral. The city's survival depended on the favor of the gods.
So failing to participate in the civic cults was eusebeia, impiety.
It was viewed as a literal threat to national security. If you did not offer the sacrifice, the gods might withhold the rain or allow a plague to strike the city.
Wow, okay, so it's not a private belief system, it's public safety.
Exactly. But as Greek philosophy developed, thinkers created a crucial distinction between two categories.
Okay, what were they?
While an atheist was someone who lacked belief in the gods. That was considered a philosophical error, a lack of intellectual perception. You were viewed as foolish or uneducated.
Right, just sort of intellectually deficient in their eyes.
Yeah. But an eusebius, an ungodly person, was something far more dangerous. The eusebius actively violated treaties, betrayed refugees, or broke the law.
So it was an objective violation of justice, not just a bad attitude.
Right. The ungodly person was a menace to the fabric of society.
And the Septuagint translators capitalized on this distinction, didn't they?
They did. They translated the Hebrew word for wicked, rasha, with ospes.
It denotes a rebel, someone who objectively violates God's law.
Yes. So an atheist just has the wrong ideas, but the ungodly person acts out a deliberate rebellion against the moral order.
Which brings up one of the most famous verses in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 1, verse 18, Paul speaks of God's wrath being revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness.
And linguistically, Paul does something highly deliberate there. He binds those two concepts tightly together using a rhetorical device called a hendiatus.
Okay, let's break that term down for clarity.
Sure.
A hendiatus is essentially when you use two words connected by and to express one single complex idea. Instead of saying, I drank from a cup of gold, you say, I drank from cups and gold.
Right. The two words bleed into one concept.
So how is Paul using it here?
Paul uses this device to show that ungodliness and unrighteousness are inseparable. Ungodliness, the vertical rebellion against God, inevitably produces unrighteousness, the horizontal rebellion against fellow humans.
You cannot separate a false view of the Creator from a destructive treatment of creation.
Right. If you reject the authority of the lawgiver, you will inevitably violate the rights of your neighbor.
That's a powerful connection. Then Paul makes an absolutely shocking claim just a few chapters later. In Romans chapter 4, verse 5, he says that God justifies the ungodly. He justifies the ospes.
Yeah, that statement, that would have sounded like absolute madness to both a Greek philosopher and a Jewish Pharisee.
I mean, to the Greek, the ospes is the treaty breaker, the menace to society. Why would the divine order justify a menace?
And to the Jew, the ospes is the wicked rebel against the Torah. The Old Testament explicitly states that human judges must condemn the wicked.
Right.
But it is the scandal of grace. God does not justify the pious, eusebes, because no human being possesses perfect piety on their own merit. He justifies the ungodly rebel who does nothing but trust in the provision of Christ. That cuts right across every human system of merit.
It dismantles human boasting entirely. We contribute nothing to our salvation except the sin that makes it necessary.
Exactly. But practically speaking, this created massive historical friction for the early church.
Oh, I'm sure.
Early Christians were widely considered ethioi, atheists, because they refused to worship the visible civic gods. They had no temples, no statues, no sacrifices.
To the Roman eye, a religion without a temple or a sacrifice was not a religion at all. It was atheism.
Yeah. The Christians desperately wanted to prove to Rome that even though they were atheists regarding the pagan gods, they were not atheists.
They were not wicked rule breakers.
Right. They paid their taxes, cared for the poor, rescued discarded infants, and lived moral lives. They were saying, we reject your pantheon, yes, but look at our lives. We are not a threat to the moral fabric of society.
Unfortunately, the general populace often refused to make that distinction.
They really did. We see this tragically in the martyrdom of Polycarp in the 2nd century.
Let's look at that event. Polycarp was an elderly bishop in Smyrna.
Yes.
And to really grasp what is happening there, you have to picture the sensory overload of a Roman amphitheater.
It's intense.
You have the roar of thousands of spectators, the smell of dust and blood, the sheer intimidation of the Roman state apparatus sitting in the stands.
And Polycarp is arrested and brought into the center of the stadium.
And The Roman proconsul tries to give him an out, probably out of pity for his old age, right?
Yeah, he urges Polycarp to swear by the genius of Caesar and to shout, "Away with the atheists."
So he wants Polycarp to denounce his fellow Christians to appease the crowd.
Yes. Instead, Polycarp looks grimly at the bloodthirsty pagan crowd in the stadium. He waves his hand toward them, groans, looks up to heaven and says, "Away with the atheists."
He flips the script completely.
He does. He takes their own civic insult and throws it right back at the pagan crowd. He is declaring that the crowd worshipping false gods are the true atheists.
That is just incredible bravery.
And when pressed further to curse Christ, Polycarp famously replied that he had been a servant of Christ for 86 years and his king had never done him any wrong. How could he blaspheme his savior?
And he was burned at the stake.
He was. He was executed as an assize by the state, even though his life was a picture of perfect Christian eusebeia.
The state condemned him as a rebel, but history remembers him as a faithful martyr.
Yeah.
We conclude our lexical analysis by looking at an adjective from this family that describes the visible weight of a believer's life.
Ah, yes.
The word is semnos. It translates to serious, dignified, or worthy of reverence. It is an aesthetic term as much as a moral one.
Yes, in Greek culture, it described things that command instant, involuntary respect.
Give us some examples of how they used it.
Well, it was used to describe royal thrones, the head of Zeus, the solemnity of Doric music, and the gravity of a Greek tragedy. It denoted a visible deportment that commands respect.
It's heavy.
It is. Aristotle viewed it as the precise mean between overbearing severity and frivolous charm.
Oh, that's a brilliant distinction. So the semnos person is not a tyrant who makes everyone cower in fear, but they're also not a clown desperate for a laugh.
Right. They have a settled internal gravity that projects outward.
So it is not just about being a nice person. It is about carrying a certain weight.
Yeah. And we see this word pop up in the New Testament as well.
Where do we see it?
In Philippians 4, verse 8, Paul tells the church to think about whatever is true, whatever is honorable, that is our word, semnos, whatever, is just pure and lovely. And more tellingly, in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 2, it is a strict requirement for church leaders. The deacons must be semnos. The older men must be semnos.
Their lives must possess semnotas or gravity.
Yes. We need to contrast semnos with another Greek virtue, sophron, which means internal self-control.
Okay, what's the difference?
Semnos is entirely about the external, visible weight of a person's life that commands respect from outsiders. It is the aesthetic of holiness. It is the way a person carries themselves when they walk into a room.
Let's bring this into the present moment and look at modern social dynamics. Modern culture highly values authenticity, approachability, and humor in its leaders. We want the guy we can get a beer with. We want the pastor who wears sneakers, sits on a stool, and tells self-deprecating jokes to show how relatable he is.
Very true.
But ancient culture, both pagan and Christian, valued semnodos. Has something been lost in abandoning the pursuit of gravity?
That raises a highly critical question for the modern church. By prioritizing a friction-free, ultra-approachable demeanor, we risk stripping the faith of its transcendent weight.
If a leader constantly aims for charm and relatability, they may forfeit the semnogos required to shepherd people through intense suffering.
Right, or to declare the objective truth of God's judgment and grace. Gravity is not arrogance. It is the physical manifestation of someone who has spent time contemplating a holy God.
When a congregation faces a tragedy, they do not need a comedian. They need a leader with the gravity to stand firm in the storm.
Yeah.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We traced the linguistic arc of the Seb root. We started with a literal, physical flinch on the battlefields of Homer, discussing the dust and terror of ancient combat.
And we saw it morph into a civic virtue in Athens, a concept Jewish translators working in Alexandria found too hollow for their covenantal God.
Then we looked at how the early church rejected the dualism of their culture to reclaim a robust New Testament vision of godliness, a life lived in everyday faithfulness, changing diapers and working jobs with visible, undeniable gravity.
It is a remarkable linguistic trajectory, showing how the early church did not just borrow words, they completely rewired their internal logic to communicate the gospel.
They took pagan vocabulary and infused it with the doctrine of creation and the scandal of grace.
It's beautiful, really.
I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Think about modern architecture, our digital spaces, and contemporary worship. We just talked about semnodos, the visible weight that commands respect. The ancient world understood that certain music, physical spaces, and personal demeanors carried a visible weight that demanded reverence. A soaring cathedral forces your eyes upward. A quiet, dignified liturgy asks you to slow down.
The physical environment shapes the internal disposition.
But today, we live highly casual, frictionless digital lives. Everything is a swipe, a scroll, a quick dopamine hit. We build buildings that look like corporate office parks instead of sanctuaries. If our environment is entirely devoid of gravity, have we eliminated our capacity to feel that ancient Seb? Are we losing the basic human ability to stand in awe of a holy God? Thank you for joining us for this session of Reformed Thinking.